transparency and how we can bring better, accurate, reliable information about the election process to the voters. So I will start with Kathleen Hale. Kathleen Hale is a professor of political science at Auburn University, and she's the director of the graduate program in election administration. She's a major expert on election administration and just published a new book titled How We Vote, Innovations in American Elections from Georgetown University Press with Dr. Mitchell Brown, also at Auburn University. She has a very close relationship with election officials and other election system stakeholders around the country. And she's a recognized leader in featuring the insights of the practice community alongside academic research. Rachel Glickhouse, and we're so happy that you can join us. Rachel is a journalist and the partner manager for ProPublica's Electionland project. Previously, she was partner manager for ProPublica's Documenting Hate for 3 years. She teaches at the Craig New York Graduate School of Journalism at SUNY and has also taught at the New School. She has also worked at Univision, Medium, and American Society Council of the Americas. And last but not least, David Becker. He's the executive director and founder of the nonprofit Center for Election Innovation Research, leading the center's successful efforts to help election officials of both parties all around the country ensure that all eligible voters can vote conveniently in a system with expert administration, including election cybersecurity, disinformation, foreign interference, long lines, and other issues with in-person voting, mail and early voting, and voter registration. Thank you all for being here. So let me kick things off with all these stories we're in the news that there is systemic and intentional voter suppression or voter fraud, starting the discussion about how we cover election stories. So what do you see as the biggest challenges that reporters face when covering elections? And what do you think is the impact for voter trust when such irregularities are sensationalized excessively in the news?
Well, I'll go ahead and start with just a couple of blanket observations. And one is that there's a lot of good news out there. And that is that voters have more choices than they ever had before, voting in person, voting early, voting by mail, using vote centers, curbside voting, any number of things. And so there are a lot of choices now for voters, which makes an already very complicated system even more complicated for the media to cover. And you know, the good news of that is that there's a lot of complexity. The bad news is that if we try to simplify it into a phrase like vote by mail, as a recent example, we quickly find out that we're not being accurate, and that can be frustrating. And so the complexity, you know, sort of the reality of the complexity, sort of contrasted with the obvious need to simplify, to communicate, those two things sort of work against each other.
I'll just add, I think it's really important to recognize where we are in the cycle in reporting. That there are, one of the things that's really challenging for those of us that work in elections is that most attention on the issues happens during the time, most media attention on the issues happens during the time when we literally cannot change anything. You know, whether we're talking about voter registration policy, whether we're talking about voting technology, we're talking about a variety of different things, and we literally cannot change them right now. And yet the media doesn't cover them next spring when the legislatures are in session and they might be considering these changes and they're really relevant to people. So I think right now, actually, and this kind of builds on what Kathleen said, I actually think in some ways the media's job is easier, but I don't know that they recognize that. Right now, there are a whole lot of things that are not worth reporting on, not because they're not important, but because they're not relevant to the current important, imminent things that we're dealing with. And that is specifically, how can we help voters navigate this process in the next 11 days and give them confidence that that process has integrity. I'll give you an example. Today, there was a news story in a perceived as credible major city newspaper about that the headline said, basically the voting systems are vulnerable to hacking. First of all of this information, this system has been in place for well over a year. All of the information in this article had been available for months, if not over a year. They didn't talk to anyone who pushed back on this. It left a lot of information out. It's actually not an accurate piece, but most importantly, they're basically doing the work of our foreign adversaries, telling people in this state that they can't trust the voting technology, which is despicable in my mind at this point in time. I mean, there might be legitimate discussions that could be had later. There was, I'll just say it was on NPR. There was a piece yesterday on NPR about alleged voter database hacks. All information that has been known for literally years has been discredited and debunked by people who've looked at it, and yet it was brought up on NPR. There's nothing that can be done about the voter databases right now. I mean, what the security that's in place is the security that's in place, and we have to be really careful not to kind of increase voters' angst about the system at a point in time when that will literally do no good. So I think it's really important to understand, in some ways, the only relevant issues for discussion right now have actually shrunk, because we're literally over 50 million votes have already been cast. We're in the middle of an election. And at this point, I think that consideration it needs to be made. And I'll just say briefly also, I think there are more good journalists working in this space than there ever have been, and people who really understand this issue. And there's a lot more good stories that really understand this than I've seen in any other election cycle.
So I'll just weigh in on some things that are actually not as topic related, but are related to some very logistical challenges that journalists are facing. So first of all, media tends to be very reactive instead of being able to spend time doing planning and being proactive. And I do think there are a ton of outlets doing great proactive reporting where they've put together a lot of guides and service-oriented reporting to help voters navigate the system this year, particularly in states where rules have changed and voters might be choosing a different method of voting than they've ever tried before. So I do think there are plenty of folks doing that, but I would say that as an industry, we tend to be very reactive. And that is why often journalists may not be thinking about elections, especially this year, when so many other things are happening, until very, very late, unfortunately. So I've been running the Electionland project since January, and I have tried to get interest from news outlets around the country throughout the year, and I've had some success in doing that. But we have people who have been so busy trying to cover all their bases with the pandemic, the economic crisis, the many, many things happening all over the country, that elections sometimes don't get thought about too much until very late in the game. I do think what David said is important, that this year, election day is not the only game in town. We've basically had an election day every day for the past couple weeks, right, where people are actively voting around the country. And I would also say that because of the economic crisis, among other factors, media is under more pressure than ever in terms of the industry, folks losing their jobs, getting laid off, folks having to take on 4 or 5 roles in one person rather than 1 or 2. So people themselves are stretched extraordinarily thin. So if there are people who have not been on this beat before, if they are new relatively to covering elections and the intricacies involved in the kind of source building that you really need to do to cover them well, they might be scrambling and just getting assigned to something very last minute in these last couple of weeks of elections. So I think what everyone has said is absolutely true. I would just wanted to sort of give a perspective on what I know are some very simple logistical issues that sometimes are coming up.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I would like to add something as well, and you're right. And it also looks like we observe some issues with capacity, especially at the local level with reporting elections. one of the newspapers here in Mississippi, I think the Mississippi Free Press, they got one of those grants from the Trusted Election Network, and now they have created great visuals to report absentee numbers across the state, which the Secretary of State does not disclose on the website, but they have been very good in reporting that information every day, and that is the only source that we have so far. Instead of calling the Secretary of State's office every day and asking. So you're right, it does seem that there is more, there's the need for capacity, but also the willingness to do a great job and get the information out to voters and other stakeholders as well. Thank you. Let me ask you one more question, and maybe Rachel, you can start with this one. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm wondering how, in your experience, election officials, particularly local election officials, how do they respond to requests by journalists, and how has your interaction been in that respect when you want, quotes for a story or more information when you're doing your research, and the rest of the panelists can chime in on that interaction between election officials and journalists, and whether if election officials receive training on how to deal with reporters or not. So can you describe the relationship a little bit?
Sure. I don't do a ton of this. This is really happening with some more of my colleagues and also all of the journalists I interact with through our network. We have more than 150 national and local newsrooms that we work with as part of Electionland. So I think it really varies, but I know that how vital it is to establish relationships with those officials. And that's something that we talk about whenever we do webinars or trainings with our partner reporters, that we really emphasize the need to not just have these people hear from you, the day before election day for the first time, that these are people that you need to cultivate and really treat as sources that you're going to establish a relationship with, so that they actually answer your phone call when you're calling on election day at 10 a.m. to ask why this polling place hasn't opened yet, right? So I think it's really important to think. Something else we often emphasize is that journalists think of themselves as part of this elections ecosystem. We are all part of the system, and we need to be connected to election officials and have an ongoing flow of communication, so that we are familiar with each other, so that there is a level of trust, or like at least a minimum level of trust between them, so that we can really get important information communicated as quickly as possible, especially when we are in the period of time we're in now, where things are happening super quickly. And also election administrators are under a huge amount of pressure at the moment, particularly in places that are dealing with unprecedented levels of mail voting and are dealing with a huge amount of paperwork and a huge amount of processing. So I think it really varies, but I do think that folks that spend the time cultivating those relationships tend to have better outcomes and more success in getting the right answers when they need them.
I guess I'll go next. I think one of the most important things, and Rachel alluded to this, is understanding the election calendar and understanding how these things work with local election officials. If you call them right now and ask them for a data dump of something that they might have to collect, they're not going to appreciate it very much. They're very, very busy right now with a lot of things going on. I also, I think it's important to understand the mindset of the local election official. These local election officials tend to be very risk averse individuals, which is a good thing in elections. But they also, I often say when I'm talking to lay audiences about this, that there's never a headline on the day after the election that everything went great. People only know their local election official usually when something has gone terribly wrong. For those people who are as old as I am or older, we'll remember the name Teresa Lepore, who is the Palm Beach County election official in Florida in 2000. I can't name another election official in Florida in 2000. I do this for a living, but I'll remember Teresa Lepore's name. Most people who went through that election will know it too. And that's because things went horribly wrong. And so just understanding that mindset is really important. That being said, there's a lot more they can do. We are seeing more good quality data and transparency being put up on websites as a matter of course at the local and state level, but we aren't all the way where we need to be. I mean, the best possible answer when you have a data question is that you just found it by Googling it. It was up on their website and you got exactly what you needed, and you didn't have to bother them because they're doing a good job of updating that regularly. I mean, a good example of how far we've come is if you look at something like the United States Election Project right now that Michael McDonald runs at the University of Florida, and the early voting numbers that they're coming up with. By the way, if you look closely, you'll see not every state is as good as every other state in terms of how they're pushing that data out or making it available to be pulled by the United States Election Project. But the mere fact that we've got data on 52.5 million ballots that have already come in, at least right before this call when I checked, is pretty amazing. I think 8-12 years ago, I don't think that would have been possible, and that's a real positive thing. So if you just have a really good sense of what election officials are doing, it's good to push them on being more transparent and putting more data up on the web. It's not good necessarily to do it right now. It will be very good next. I think one of the things I think a lot of journalists don't realize, one of the best times to get a lot of data and look for this information is early in a year right after a presidential election. Voter records are the most up to date right after a presidential election when voter history has been updated. There's a really good time and opportunity, but of course the demand, the supply of data is really great, but the demand is not as high by media consumers at that point in time. But it's a great time if you want to dig really deep into a story. I would suggest January, February, March of next year is a great time to look for data. It's going to be widely available. Election officials are going to be receptive to requests, and they might even get the message that they should push more of this out onto their websites.
Yeah, I'm reflecting as I'm speaking now with on things that Rachel and David have said, and they're both so accurate and right on about the two different perspectives. The complexity of the system works against both sides. The election administrators at the local level, who would be the people that you would speak with as a reporter, they are very, very, very good at a very complicated job. And they know the ins and outs in every little piece. And so any kind of question that doesn't appreciate the complexity or appreciate the nuance of something is not likely to be likely to be well received in a stressful environment. And so, the comment that reporters view themselves as part of the team, part of the election ecosystem. I've worked with thousands of election officials, and I might be able to name 5 election officials who would go that far. It's a tricky relationship because, as you pointed out, the no news, no good news gets reported is important. And there's a capacity question underlying all of this. The people that I can think of that have visible, good, productive relationships with the media and about which I think the media would agree are either very small or very small offices where everybody in the community knows everybody personally anyway, or they're big organizations that can hire professional staff to work in that field. And so, in training and education that I do with election officials around the country, I can tell you in a room of 100 people, maybe 1 or 2 would raise their hands when you ask them, do you have a comms person? And I can see the people out in the room whispering to each other saying, what is that? I don't have one. What is that? Am I supposed to have one? I can't afford that. Where will I get one? And so the knowledge gap, and the experience gap is probably even broader than our conversation suggests. If you drill down below maybe the 50 or 100 largest election jurisdictions in the country, who serve I won't have the statistics at hand, but who serve the majority of registered voters. The rest of the 8,000 election jurisdictions just don't have that. They just don't have that. And so I guess what that means is that the relationships are even more important, stretched by the capacity on both sides.
Have you experienced any election officials who are skeptical or hesitant to respond to requests for information by journalists because maybe they don't want to be scrutinized, or they think that this information should be safeguarded and not shared?
I'm sorry. Not because they don't want to share transparent information, but skeptical of motivations of the requests of people. Oh, without question. Without question.
There is a sense that there have been journalists who kind of operated on a gotcha basis with some election officials, and they feel burned sometimes. I mean, there is again, so no one goes into election administration to get rich or famous. It's incredibly hard work. Everyone thinks you do work one day a year on election day when you're working 24/7 sometimes. You're only noticed when you do something wrong. I've been fascinated. There are people who often run for Secretary of State because they think it's a stepping stone to other office. Those tend to be the people that don't do great jobs at the Secretary of State job, and it rarely is a stepping stone for greater office. If you actually look at the data, very few Secretary of States elevate to higher office. It is a really hard job. And a lot of the media that don't cover this regularly are often the ones who think they found, some activist talked to them, or they found something, they think they've got a gotcha on the election. And if you approach it that way, election officials are going to be skeptical of motives. That's exactly right, Kathleen, I think. And now there are, and this goes to Rachel's point earlier, there are the media out there who have taken this on as kind of a calling and have become experts in the election administration field themselves, and attend the conferences and talk with people and get to know them as human beings. And they've earned trust over time, where there are members of the media right now who can call local election officials and state election officials and just say, hey, I need to understand this thing. Can you help walk me through this? And they will spend time with them on the phone and talk them through it. And sometimes there's something there and sometimes there isn't, because they've earned that level of trust. And it's amazing what you can get at when you're willing to put the work in as a journalist to build that level of trust with these people and understand that these, look, there some bad election officials. I mean, we won't tell you who they are. Very few, but there are some that aren't that great. But the vast majority are pretty good, and there's a range of competence, but the competence level is generally pretty good, and some are outstanding. Some blow my mind. I mean, if you look at, like, for instance, what's going on in Harris County, Texas right now. Look at the turnout in Harris County, Texas, the largest county, one of the largest counties in the United States. They're not allowed to do no excuse mail balloting. It's excuse only. They're allowed to have only one drop box. They've got tension between them and the state election office, and yet they have been processing 7 figures worth of voters in that county in just a few days, mostly without any problems. I mean, it is. If we weren't in a pandemic and I could actually travel, I'd want to go down there and give those people a hug. I mean, it is. It's amazing. And I think if you approach it from that perspective, you can get past the initial skepticism. And honestly, people will share with you some really intimate details about how elections work and how they can be improved.
Yeah, I want to jump in really quickly with a follow-on, just to be clear. I have had really great conversations with very many members of the media this year, better conversations than before. I've also had more conversations than ever with people who are just learning. And the worst combination, if I can be this blunt, the worst combination is somebody who doesn't have all of the information about how the process works and isn't interested in learning those details, but they're sure that there's something wrong. And that's what they want to hear about. And election officials they don't have the patience for that. They don't have the patience for that, and nor should they, honestly. And I want to be clear. Everybody's trying to do a good job. It takes work on both sides. So
I'll give another good example, and then I want to give Rachel a chance to chime in, but you just made me think of something, Kathleen. There were a couple stories just in the last few weeks about voter purges in Georgia and Wisconsin. Both of these so-called purges, first of all, Wisconsin wasn't a purge. They didn't actually remove anyone from the list. Georgia, the people that were allegedly removed from the list in error, everyone had been removed over a year ago in the summer of 2019. The list was publicly placed on the Georgia Secretary of State's website. And the people who wrote this so-called report published it days before the voter registration deadline in Georgia for this election. It's very hard to establish any goodwill in that. And it honestly if there were two possibilities, either they were completely wrong in their analysis, which I think is correct, that they were wrong in their analysis and they overstated the problem, in which case they should be ashamed for putting anything out along those lines. Or they were right in their analysis, but they let the voters of Georgia down because they waited too long to let them know. All of those voters could have gotten registered during that year that they waited. Now, there are people who do analyses of these that are entirely credible, that look deeply into these lists and try to confirm how much of them are accurate and then get this data out as quickly as possible so we can fix the errors. But that's a great example of kind of gotcha journalism that doesn't actually help the voters or election officials improve, rather than something that actually informs the debate.
That's a good point. And something that worries me is we did hear some stories about election officials receiving death threats. And it does seem that, voters are more skeptical about the process, or they feel that the rhetoric right now is, the election is rigged or someone is voting. And that, other than trust, there's an actionable threatening election officials and not trusting them. So it can create very challenging scenarios for election officials to do their jobs. And I will note something that Kathleen mentioned, and she's right. I have received a lot of requests by reporters across several states in this season, where many will say that, I'm trying to reach my election official and they won't respond, or I want to talk to you first before talking to them. So perhaps what we do here also plays a role in helping build that trust and help reporters understand some of the intricacies in the election process before they talk to, or even after they talk to, election officials. So I'm glad that this is a nice segue to talk about some of the best practices, because David and Kathleen, you kind of mentioned that as well. So what, in your experience, what are some of the good practice examples of transparency that you have seen among election officials and among reporters to be able to report factual and reliable information?
I think there are, sort of two categories of ways to think about this, and I'll just sort of put that out there and see where it goes. One way to think about it is what happens during the event, right? In the heat of the moment, from the beginning of whatever period of time, the media starts to focus on things, sort of the in the moment conversations and issues that come up as things occur. The other piece of transparency is something that David alluded to and Rachel earlier, which is having information available on websites and having publicly available all of the very public information that's part of the election process. I'll just throw out maybe a third piece of this, which is the idea that local election officials are our neighbors. They are members of our community. And I think it's important to recognize the trust and the transparency that happens when you as a member of the public understand that the election official is the person that you send your kids to school with, or that you go to church with, or that you see at the grocery store or out in the community. The local election officials that I work with are very active. Now, these would be people who run the offices or have high-level staff jobs, but they're very active in their communities. And so there's a transparency that comes from very ordinary civic transactions, if you will. The idea that I know who you are and I can call you and I trust the information that you have. There's a capacity piece against all of this, and I'll just, the capacity piece can't be ignored. We'll have to deal with it after 2020 for sure.
I would just say that one thing that I think is important for journalists to better contextualize in terms of how elections are run is that people often want to have somebody to blame when things go wrong. And you are going to call your local election administrator, just like David said about Florida, when something goes wrong, and that's the person you're going to quote or mention that you tried to call. But I think it's really important that journalists remember the chain of accountability when it comes to election administration, because administrators are given the hardest part of the job, essentially, to literally make an election happen, and all of the steps that need to be taken to put an election on, often with budgets that are very small and are struggling and are even more limited now that we are in the midst of this crisis. Not to mention the fact that election offices now have to spend money on things like PPE and all sorts of things they never had to spend money on before, because we are literally voting in a pandemic. So I think what's important that it's often difficult to contextualize, particularly in stories that have a limited space on a newspaper page or a limited time in a TV segment, is that some of the problems that ultimately happen are not necessarily the fault of administrators, but you have to sort of look further up the chain in terms of who is funding this, how much funding are they giving, who has the control over the purse strings to give funding to these election administrators to make elections happen, who is making the rules and laws about how elections are run. This year has been an absolute mess in terms of rules around absentee voting and how quickly things change back and forth. I remember at some point I was trying to keep track of if South Carolina has a witness requirement on their absentee ballots, and there was like 1 week where it changed like 2 or 3 times because of the legal battle. So I think keeping in mind as well and trying to be very clear about how certain things happen are often sometimes the result of other key holders of power, including legislators, heads of governors. So I think it's a very tricky sort of thing to navigate, because we are often trying to write something very short and to the point, or you only have a certain amount of airtime. But I think it's important that administrators are often sort of left holding the bag for things that may not be in their control. As somebody mentioned about the threats people were getting. I remember from the story my colleague Jessica Huseman did, some of that happened as a result of a lot of misinformation that happened during the primary in Louisville, in which the election actually went pretty well that day, but the news surrounding it made people very confused and made people very angry, who were even from other states, right? So they had to deal with this added element of literally people from other states calling them to yell at them.
I want to build on something Rachel said, because it's just so important. A presidential election in particular is a period of time, a short period of time, where 150 million Americans do something at roughly the same time that they don't do very often, in a process run by 1 million volunteers in 10,000 different jurisdictions. In other words, stuff happens. That's normal. We're seeing some effort by some candidates and parties to try to make it seem as if episodic mistakes have some more nefarious impact on integrity. And you know, I was just trying to think of an analogy. Imagine going through the drive-thru at McDonald's and getting the wrong order when you got home, and blaming the CEO of McDonald's for that as if it was something intentional to you. And that's essentially what's happening. You'll see Democrats and Republican-led jurisdictions blame Republicans for that, and vice versa. And sometimes it's not even necessarily accurate. Georgia is a great example. Again, I keep going back to it. You've got a Republican Secretary of State, but you've got a democratically dominated Board of Elections in Fulton County, Georgia. And Democrats will blame the Republican Secretary of State for something that happens in Fulton County, and Republicans will blame the Democratic Board of Elections. We've got to stop this. And it's one of the big problems we face. And too often there are some in the media, and not the majority, but some in the media who just fall into that easy, lazy story. You know, Republicans are doing this, Democrats are doing this. Republicans are suppressing the vote, Democrats are allowing rampant fraud, right? I mean, these are themes that we see in stories regularly. Long lines is a great example of how that's happening. Long lines at the beginning of voting, on the first day of early voting, when the polls are just opening up, that's not a sign of any problem at all. They haven't even opened up the polling site yet. It's a sign of voter enthusiasm. And yet somehow, as a society, we are able to take something that is an unabashed good and turn it into a negative. We're really remarkable in that way in some cases. And you know, sure enough, what did we see in Georgia? The first couple of days, we saw some long lines. We also learned there was a legitimate issue with the connection between the e-poll books and the early voting sites and the voter database at the Secretary of State's office. That was resolved fairly quickly, but by the third day, almost every site, people were in and out within an hour, and in most cases under a half an hour. And the main site, the biggest site in all of Georgia, State Farm Arena in Atlanta, they were in and out in 20 minutes. That's not being reported much, which is a shame, because you'd want to tell the Fulton County voters, who can go to any of the sites within Fulton County, go to the one with the shortest line. That would be the best thing to do, but we're not doing that very well. So I think, you know, there's a variety of things that are being done now, in terms, back to your original question, Leah, which is, you know, where are we seeing good transparency, good in data. You know, I mentioned the early voting sites. There's efforts like the Voting Information Project, which tried to standardize certain elements of data, like polling place locations, and get that out via Google in particular. We're seeing more and more of that, but we need to do better. We need to do a much better job. There's no standardization of data points across the nation in many ways. Mail voting and absentee voting, two different terms, is a great example. Early voting, some places call it, you know, in-person absentee. North Carolina calls it one stop. I mean, there's a variety of different things that we do, so it's really hard to get some standardization of data so that we can compare states. So I think you know, we do some work on that. Others do a lot of great work on that. You know, I think that I think we can do a lot better, but I also look back, you know, when I first got back in the elections game many years ago, 22 years ago, it was almost impossible to get any of this data. And a lot of it was stored literally on paper in an office. You'd have to call and talk to someone on the phone. And if you want to do that in Texas, you might have to call 254 different county offices and get them on the phone to get any kind of information. Georgia has 159 counties. Michigan and Wisconsin have, you know, 1,500 to 2,000 local election jurisdictions. So being able to get that data standardized, pushed up to the state level, so there's one-stop shops for this data, is really important. And one other quick point I'd make, I think the EAC's Election Administration Voting Survey, which has also improved over time, and I'd love to hear from the three of the other panelists about this if they agree. It's improved over time, and I think that has helped push some standardization and better data collection and publication practices amongst local and state election jurisdictions. And I think we have still a long way to go, but I think we're a lot better off now than we used to be.
Yeah, I'm happy to to comment on the eaves, but I want to go back to your original question, Leah, just really quickly and offer up a couple of really concrete things that are examples of sort of on the ground local practices that election officials are doing, and try to connect that back to, you know, sort of the experience that Rachel is having with her colleagues and sort of the good news story idea. You know, in some jurisdictions, election officials have used, you know, basic off-the-shelf technology to develop apps that show the wait time at polling locations, that show, you know, how long you might have to wait here, there, or another place. In some jurisdictions, there are real-time sort of hotspot maps that show the wait times. There are, I'm sure there's a sophisticated name for it, and I'm sure David knows what it is, but I can't think of it right this hot second. Look at like a map, a heat map of a county with all the precincts or drop boxes laid out on it, and you can see basically the rate of return. Right now, these are in-office tools, right? But to the extent that they are made available to the media to watch in real time, like the media can watch in real time ballot counting in many jurisdictions. Those are all tools of transparency that have been built into election office practices. I don't know a single election official in a local office who says, wow, I've got something to hide, I need to work on that. Make it harder for somebody to get to. So the things are there. I think maybe local officials don't often think of them as things that the media would be interested in.
That's a good point. And a little bit of advertising. I recently read the the NCSL's report on observers, and some states do explicitly say that the media can be present in some of these processes, right? And when something that we don't know is how much this is utilized by the media, and if local election officials, as you noted, extend an invitation, or reporters are proactively saying, hey, when are you doing a logic and accuracy test? I want to be part of it and report it. So perhaps that can be a good approach, either initiated from one side or the other, to utilize these resources that the state provides, either stream it to everyone, or announce that we have this happening and please come and join. Let's see, I want to have some time for questions, and let me ask a question from Daniela Bouquet that is addressed to Kathleen. Is the development of such apps or tech tools by the jurisdictions more dependent on capacity and budget, or do you think the offices using these tools and making them public have bridged the knowledge gap discussed earlier?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Daniela. And I think what we have seen in research is that the overall sort of performance of an election jurisdiction and the overall professionalism and professionalization of the staff, and those are measured in a couple of different ways that are related using the EPI and a professionalism index that I've worked on with Mitchell Brown. We can see that there are sort of underlying sort of factors that sort of lift the floor for everyone. One of them is about as simple as it can be, and it is just simply the ability for election officials to get together in different kinds of formats with researchers, with the media, with each other, and talk about things. There aren't any really big secrets about how these offices operate or what they do. And so it's to the extent, though, Daniela, that professionalization is, we think, significantly related to capacity. It's an element of capacity, but significantly related to budget. That's something that gets in the way. I think it's promising to see local jurisdictions sort of taking it upon themselves to sit down and brainstorm, how can we better serve our voters? That's what they want to do.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that really clears it up.
Do you guys want to chime in, or can I? Okay, let me ask another question. That's for David, but for all of us as well. From Yamil. David, you mentioned at the start of this that much of the coverage happening right now is no longer useful because it's not actionable. What coverage would you like to see more of in the next days? And after November 3rd, what kind of stories do you think would be useful for journalists to report, particularly to reduce public anxiety?
Gosh,
So what are the questions we should ask?
That's a great question. So I think I'm going to use the, just as an example, I'm going to use the recent revelations from the press conference that the FBI and DHS held a couple nights ago about Iranian and Russian disinformation campaigns tied to the emails that looked like they came from the Proud Boys, which are apparently originated with Iran. I saw two kinds of stories about that. The stories that were not helpful were the stories that called this a voter intimidation scheme. And talked about, I saw a story that said voters in 4 states got emails about a voter intimidation scheme, and then buried the actual important news about it later down. So first of all, voters in 4 states, is that 4 voters? Is it 4 million? We have no idea. Also, it wasn't a voter intimidation scheme. There was nothing behind it to intimidate voters. It was a disinformation scheme first and foremost. And so I really fall back on the news you can use kind of stuff. Voters do not, one thing I know from many years of doing this, I've done a ton of polling on this. I think Lia and Kathleen would agree, and Rachel. Voters don't think about elections like we do all the time. They're not well versed in them. They don't understand a lot of aspects of elections. They don't understand some basic things like what county they live in. We think that everyone knows what county they live in. They don't. A lot of them don't. And sometimes it's really confusing to know what county you live in. Like South San Francisco is not in San Francisco County. It is in San Mateo County. I don't know why that's true, but that's where it is. So voters think about this very sporadically, and to think about what they can use, which is helping them navigate the process right now. They're getting a lot of news that tells them things are changing, the partisans are warring, courts are ruling. All of these things just help them figure out how to navigate this process and how to vote as conveniently and safely as possible. Let them know that if they vote in person, they are going to have a safe experience where social distancing is enforced, where voters, all the poll workers are wearing masks, which is true. Many states are actually putting plexiglass up between the workers and the voters and other things that are there. It's really important for voters. There is a percentage of voters, it's probably somewhere between the 55th and 65th percentile of voters, that are probably still on the fence about whether they're going to vote. In this election, they might be a little bit on the more side of voting than they have been in past elections, because turnout looks like it's going to be pretty high. But there's a lot of voters that get closer and closer to election day and they're still on the fence. And if I were a member of the media, I would want to be really careful that any of my reporting wasn't the nudge that pushed them onto the side of the fence that dissuaded them from voting. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where I would want to come from as a journalist in these few days. It is totally appropriate to be talking about policy and where we can improve and where we failed in between elections, where we can do something. This is not about sweeping anything under the carpet. This is really just what is important during these next 11 days, helping voters navigate the system. And then this goes back to Kathleen's point. There's a lot of transparency that's going to be happening post-election. In terms of, I think about Philadelphia, they're going to have a major site for processing mail ballots, literally millions of ballots. Well, hundreds of thousands, I want to be careful about that, hundreds of thousands of ballots in Philadelphia. And they're going to have a 24/7 live stream on the internet. And they're going to have a media place where the media can go and watch that. And that's absolutely something that should be reported. More places should do that. A lot are going to be doing that. A lot of places are going to be doing audits of results post-election. That is open to the media, that is open to the public. In fact, it has to be useful. So those are the kinds of stories that show people there is a process, and that process is transparent. It is being viewed by proxies for you. If you're a Republican, there will be members of the Republican Party there. If you're a Democrat, there will be members of the Democratic Party there. And I think that's really important. I think confidence is the most important aspect of reporting, at least for these next few days. And then after we're all done, absolutely, we can be critical of those elements that we need to improve upon and really do the hard-hitting stories that might push us in the right direction.
Do you think that perhaps now we and by we I mean academics, reporters, any stakeholder, we have more data points to be defining these terms more accurately, because voter intimidation, or something that can be perceived as voter intimidation, like you mentioned, we have reports of this happening over the years by campaigns that send these mailers that say, we know how you voted, your neighbor knows. And it has been discussed in the context of voter intimidation. But perhaps we are better now in distinguishing between what can be voter intimidation and what cannot be. So having better definitions, do you think that might be the case?
Yeah, although I don't think we're going to agree on definitions. I think partisans use these terms for partisan purposes. They think it motivates their base. I think they're usually wrong, actually. You know, the fact of the matter is, historically, telling people that there's widespread voter suppression tells a lot of people who are on the fence about voting that if they try to vote, it's going to be hard, that they're going to be waiting in long lines, that they're going to have an argument with a poll worker about whether they're on the list, that it's going to take a long time, and ultimately their vote might not count. I'd love to see more of what you just suggested, Lia, because I do think we have data points on this. It is a lot easier to get a voter to opt out of their own volition than it is to actually physically intimidate a voter and keep a voter who wants to vote away from the polls. And that's what the people who are truly engaged in disinformation understand.
You make a good point. So you're suggesting that it might not result in someone deciding not to vote, but it primes them for a negative voter experience and ultimately not trusting whether their vote will count eventually.
Yeah, I think so. There's a great example. I think there's so much of this is perception, right? We want to have a system that has integrity and is accessible, but is also perceived to have integrity and is accessible. And I think back to the 2012 presidential election, and we all remember that every cable news network found that one polling place in Miami-Dade County. We all remember it, right? That was open till 2 a.m. with really long lines. It's what led to the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, that long line. And if you look what actually happened, we measured line distance by doing polling in the few days after the election. The CCES survey that goes out did polling. They interviewed about 50 people in each state. Now, this was happening right after the election. Florida had the longest perceived lines. But those people who responded to those polls have been consuming news articles for 3 days about how long the lines were in Florida. And what we don't know was, did someone who stood in line for 15 minutes think they had stood in line for 45? And then someone else who stood in line for 15 minutes in another state thought they had stood in line for 5 minutes? We just have these are the kinds of data points we don't have, and having a sense of that and understanding that and how perception often overwhelms reality is also very important. One of the things Rachel's heard me say this before, election day is really hard for journalists because demand for news is at its peak. It is never going to be higher, and the supply of news is zero. The only thing everyone wants to know is who's going to win, and you can't tell them anything until the polls close and you start reporting. So the 24-hour news networks send their vans around all over every swing state to find the one polling place that's the biggest mess. And so if you're just watching cable news, all you're seeing is the places that are a mess. You might have 500 polling places in Miami-Dade County and one is a problem. And all you're seeing is that there's one big problem in Miami-Dade County, and that you just infer that it's happening everywhere. That's a huge problem, and I'm sympathetic to what the media is dealing with. I mean, I'm hungry for news on election day, and there's nothing to report. And Rachel and the work she does with Electionland, I think, is so important on this. I just wanted to give a big plug on that, because all of the local news reporters, how they're feeding information in, how they're asking questions, and always the right questions, and contextualizing all of this is really important. Not to say we shouldn't report on the long lines, we should. If there are long lines, it's important for people to know that so they can plan and understand it, but also to contextualize, like, this is the only polling place we're seeing with long lines. A lot of them are just great.
Thank you, David. So we're on time, actually, and that is great. I can have a few more minutes, and I can, if you want to have some, share some more thoughts. And I think Yamil wants to say a few words before we let you go. So is there anything that you would like to add?
It's been a great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David, Kathleen, Rachel, Lia. I think of all the panels, this is one of the ones that has had the most energy and your passion for the topic just radiates. So as soon as this is over, I'm already dying to tell everyone to watch it. Thank you so much for all the information that you shared. I think it's going to help journalists feel more empowered to give coverage that will actually be useful to voters. So we really appreciate that. That's what we try to do as Election SOS, is to provide useful resources to journalists covering this. So we're really appreciative. And for everyone that tuned in, feel free to go to our website, electionsos.com, where we will have this webinar posted along with many other resources. We also have a trusted elections expert network, of which several of our lovely panelists are a part. We've had trainings by Rachel on how to cover elections. So I really encourage you to look at the other resources and to also look at the resources that our partner, the Carter Center, has. And some of them have been shared in the chat. So thank you so much for joining, and I hope you enjoy your weekend and the days ahead.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and stay sane.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.